An aging millionaire thought he had everything: money, power, a vast business empire. But when he learned he didn't have much time left, he realized he had nothing that truly mattered. His family didn't care about him. Overcome with disappointment, he drove aimlessly until fate left him stranded in a forgotten town. 2 young boys helped him, expecting nothing in return. A woman fed him without asking for payment. And for the first time in his life, the millionaire saw a kind of wealth that money could never buy. Before diving into this heartfelt story, share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. John Patterson sat at the head of a long, gleaming mahogany dining table, his untouched dinner growing cold as the quiet hum of silverware and hushed conversation filled the cavernous dining hall. Across from him, his wife Eleanor sipped her wine, barely glancing in his direction. To her right, their eldest son, Richard, typed furiously on his phone, occasionally nodding at whatever business call he had muted. On the other side, Sarah, their daughter, scrolled through a tablet, a glass of champagne beside her, entirely uninterested in the presence of her father. The news had come earlier that day, delivered with the sterile detachment of a doctor accustomed to giving people expiration dates. Pancreatic cancer. Terminal. A few months left at best. He had walked out of the hospital, numb, wondering how the wealth he had spent his entire life amassing could suddenly mean nothing in the face of death. He hadn't told them yet, thinking, perhaps foolishly, that if he did they would finally see him, that they would pause, if only for a moment, and realize that time was slipping away. But when he finally spoke, his voice steady yet hollow, saying, "I have something to tell you," the response was as indifferent as he should have expected. Eleanor glanced up briefly, waiting. Richard's fingers didn't stop moving. Sarah tapped at her screen before sighing. "What is it, Dad?" "I went to the doctor today." He took a breath, searching their faces for some sign of anticipation. "I have pancreatic cancer. It's terminal." Silence. A momentary pause. Eleanor's brow creased for a fleeting second before she nodded slowly. "I see." She reached for her wine. "Well, I suppose that means you should take it easy for a while. Let the company run itself." "Yes, Dad," Richard chimed in, eyes still locked on his phone. "We'll handle things at the firm. You should rest." "You should take a vacation," Sarah added, not looking up. "Enjoy whatever time you have left." John sat there, his chest tightening, not from the cancer, but from something far heavier. It wasn't shock he felt. It was confirmation. They weren't devastated. They weren't even shaken. To them he was a business, a balance sheet, an empire that they had been waiting to inherit. The man behind it. He had ceased to matter a long time ago. For years he had convinced himself that wealth was the measure of a life well spent, that providing them with everything, mansions, private jets, generational wealth, was proof of his love. But in this moment, sitting across from his own flesh and blood, he realized the cold, undeniable truth: he had built a family of strangers. His throat burned, but he refused to show it. He pushed back his chair, the sound of it scraping against the marble floor the only acknowledgement of his presence. "Excuse me," he muttered, standing. No one asked where he was going. No one stopped him. He left the room, walked past the towering walls lined with priceless art, past the grand chandeliers that illuminated rooms no one truly lived in. He stepped outside, the night air crisp, and climbed into his Mercedes G63, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew that he needed to get away. The city lights stretched endlessly in his rearview mirror as John drove, his hands tight on the wheel, the weight of his reality pressing heavier with each passing mile. The towering skyscrapers, the bustling streets, the polished, hollow world he had built, he needed to escape it, if only for a while. The further he drove, the less familiar the roads became. Glass and steel gave way to cracked pavement. Neon billboards faded into rusted streetlights. The skyline, once a symbol of his empire, shrank behind him until it was nothing but a distant glow. The silence in the car was deafening. He hadn't turned on the radio. He didn't need more noise. His mind was already roaring, memories flashing, regrets surfacing, thoughts colliding in a relentless storm. Was this it? Was this how it all ended? He had spent his entire life building a legacy, yet now, at the end of it, he was more alone than he had ever been. The people who bore his name, who lived in the house he provided, felt nothing when he told them he was dying. Nothing. Us. His grip on the wheel tightened as the road ahead darkened, the streetlights becoming sparse, the houses fewer. The polished luxury of the world he knew had vanished, replaced by something rougher, more real. He barely noticed the shift until the car jolted beneath him, a sharp, grinding thud echoing through the cabin. The wheel yanked violently to one side. He cursed, wrestling to keep control, but the vehicle swerved, skidding slightly before rolling to an unsteady stop on the shoulder of a near-empty road. His chest rose and fell in heavy breaths. The dashboard flickered, warning lights flashing in red. A flat tire. John exhaled sharply, pressing his fingers against his temples. He reached for his phone, instinctively, as he always had in moments of inconvenience. But when he pressed the power button, nothing happened. Dead. Of course. His eyes flickered to the rearview mirror. There was no traffic, no passing headlights, no hum of civilization. Just a dimly lit stretch of cracked asphalt and the faint sound of crickets in the distance. A bitter laugh escaped his lips. Perfect. Just perfect. He sat back, staring ahead at the empty road, the absurdity of the situation sinking in. A lifetime of wealth, power, and influence, and here he was, stranded, alone, with no one to call and nowhere to go. Then, from the corner of his eye, movement. Two figures approached from down the street, their silhouettes shifting under the flickering glow of a dying street lamp. For a brief moment, instinct flared, a reminder that this was not the part of town he belonged to, that caution was a necessity in unfamiliar places. But as they drew closer, their voices carried through the night, light, unburdened, filled with a kind of laughter that came not from luxury, but from something far rarer, genuine joy. Two black boys, no older than 12 or 13, dressed in worn-out clothes that had seen too many winters, their shoes scuffed, their hands shoved into the pockets of oversized jackets. They weren't just passing by. They had seen him. "Hey, mister," one of them called out, his voice friendly, curious. "You okay?" John hesitated. He hadn't been asked that in years. He studied them, his mind already calculating, measuring risk. But what choice did he have? He sighed, stepping out of the car. "Flat tire," he said, his voice heavier than he intended. "And I don't exactly know how to change it." The boys exchanged a glance before bursting into laughter. It wasn't mocking, just amused, like he'd just admitted he didn't know how to tie his shoes. "Man, for real." The taller one grinned, stepping closer. "All that car, and you don't know how to fix a tire?" John almost snapped back, but stopped himself. There was no malice in their tone, just genuine surprise. The shorter boy nudged his friend. "Hey, it's fine. We can help, right?" The taller one nodded. "Yeah, sure. You got a spare?" John blinked at them. There was no hesitation, no conditions. Just help, freely given. It was something he was wholly unfamiliar with. He gestured to the trunk, opening it, retrieving the spare tire and the tools he had never touched in his life. The boys got to work, moving with an efficiency that spoke of experience. "Where'd you learn this?" John asked, watching as they effortlessly lifted the car with a jack, their small hands moving with practiced ease. "Old man Hector," the shorter boy said. "He's got this shop down the block. Used to let us hang around, taught us stuff. Said it's always good to know how to fix things." John nodded slowly, watching them, realizing something. They were enjoying this. Laughing, joking as they worked, like this was just another part of their night. "What's a guy like you doing out here anyway?" the taller one asked, tightening a bolt. "You don't look like you're from around here." John hesitated. How could he explain it? That he had spent his entire life chasing wealth, only to realize it had given him nothing. That he was a man with a mansion but no home, a fortune but no family. Instead, he settled for the truth that mattered in this moment. "Just needed to get away," he said finally. The boys seemed to accept that without question. "Well, at least now you won't be stuck," the shorter one said, standing up and wiping his hands against his jeans. "That should do it." John stared at the car, stunned. They had done in 30 minutes what he had spent a lifetime unable to do, fix something without expecting a reward. He reached into his wallet, pulling out a few crisp $100 bills. "Here," he said, holding them out, "for your trouble." But the boys didn't reach for it. Instead, they looked at each other, grinning. "Nah, ma," the taller one said. "We were just helping out." John blinked. The words barely made sense to him, but— "We don't need money," the shorter one shrugged. "But if you really want to do something, there's this diner down the street. We're kinda hungry." John, still trying to process what had just happened, found himself nodding. "All right," he said. "Lead the way." The boys grinned, motioning for him to follow. As he got back into the car, he realized something strange. For the first time in a very, very long time, he wasn't in a hurry to go home. The neon sign above the diner flickered, casting a warm, golden glow onto the cracked pavement below. Helen's Diner, the name was painted in faded cursive across the window. The kind of place that hadn't changed in decades, where the scent of grilled bacon and fresh coffee clung to the air, where the hum of an old jukebox mixed with quiet conversations and the occasional burst of laughter. The boys led the way, pushing open the glass door, the little bell above it chiming softly as they stepped inside. John followed, feeling strangely out of place, his tailored jacket and polished shoes stark against the worn-down booths and checkered floor. The walls were lined with old photos, newspaper clippings, memories of a town that had been forgotten by the world, but not by the people who called it home. Behind the counter stood a woman, mid-50s, strong but warm-eyed, wiping her hands on her apron as she turned toward them. "Well, well," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent years looking after people who weren't her own but loved them like they were. "Look who decided to show up." She leaned forward, squinting at the boys. "Didn't I just feed you two this morning?" The shorter one grinned, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Yeah, but we found this guy on the road. He had a flat. We fixed it." The woman's gaze shifted to John, her eyes scanning him with the sharpness of someone who had seen too many people come and go, someone who could tell the difference between trouble and something else. "That so?" she asked, crossing her arms. John cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked, how rich he must seem in a place like this. "Yeah, they helped me out." He hesitated before adding, "I owed them a meal." The woman studied him a moment longer, then, to his surprise, she smiled. Not the kind of polite, practiced smile he was used to from business dinners and cocktail parties, but something real, something genuine. "Well," she said, turning toward the kitchen, "I hope you're hungry, 'cause I don't let people leave my place until they're full." The boys whooped, sliding into one of the booths near the window. John hesitated for only a second before following, lowering himself onto the cracked leather seat. The warmth of the place pressed in around him, the smell of fresh bread, the quiet hum of conversation, the laughter of a couple sitting in the far corner. It was nothing like the five-star restaurants he was used to. No hushed voices, no overpriced wine, no waiters hovering like shadows. But somehow it felt realer than any place he had ever been. Helen returned with 3 steaming plates, setting them down without ceremony. Pancakes stacked high, eggs scrambled just right, crispy bacon on the side. It was the kind of meal people didn't eat in a rush, the kind you sat down for, savored, shared. "So," she said, wiping her hands on her apron and leaning against the counter, "you from around here?" John hesitated. "No," he could have said. "I'm a millionaire. I own companies. I live in a penthouse with people who don't care if I live or die." Instead, he found himself saying, "Just passing through." Helen nodded like she understood something he hadn't said. "Well, lucky for you, you ran into these two." She glanced at the boys, her expression softening. "They're good kids." The shorter one beamed. The taller one rolled his eyes. "Come on, Helen, you'll ruin our reputation." Helen snorted. "Oh, please. I've seen you give away half your food to that old man on 5th Street. Don't act like you're some big-shot troublemaker." John watched them, something unfamiliar twisting in his chest. They had nothing, and yet here they were, helping, giving, living. He picked up his fork, took a bite, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he tasted something. Not just the food, but the moment. The feeling of being somewhere that didn't expect anything from him. When they finished, John reached for his wallet, pulling out cash, but before he could set it down, Helen shook her head. "Not here," she said simply. He frowned. "What?" "You helped them. They helped you. That's how it works around here." She smiled, tilting her head. "You're not the first guy to come through those doors looking lost. And you sure as hell won't be the last. John stared at her, the weight of what she was saying sinking in. She thought he was one of them, not a millionaire, not a man with a fortune, just another person passing through, struggling like the rest. And the strangest part, he didn't correct her. As they stepped out of the diner, the cold night air met them, crisp and quiet. The neon open sign buzzed faintly above the door, casting a warm glow onto the sidewalk. John took a slow breath, his hands deep in his pockets, still absorbing the strangeness of the evening. He had spent an entire lifetime inside places that demanded prestige, towering boardrooms, extravagant penthouses, Michelin-starred restaurants. But tonight, in a small-town diner with two kids who had nothing, he had felt more human than he had in years. The boys walked ahead, still chatting between themselves, their laughter light and unburdened. As they reached the street corner, they paused. An old man stood there, his frail figure hunched, struggling to step off the curb. Without hesitation, both boys moved. One gently placed a hand on the man's back, the other held out an arm to steady him. The man smiled, nodding in gratitude as they slowly helped him across. John stood frozen, watching. No hesitation, no expectation of anything in return. And then, as if sensing his gaze, one of the boys turned, catching his eye. A grin spread across his face, and he lifted a hand in a carefree wave. "See you around, old man." John chuckled, shaking his head. "Not that old," he muttered to himself. The boys disappeared down the street, their figures blending into the dim glow of streetlights. John lingered for a moment, staring after them, his breath slow, measured, as something he couldn't quite name pressed against his ribs. He had built everything. An empire, a fortune, a legacy that spanned cities. Yet here in a town that didn't know his name, he had seen more wealth in the actions of two boys than he had ever seen in the numbers on his bank statements. He climbed back into his car, the leather seats familiar against his back, but for the first time they felt cold. His hands gripped the wheel, but he didn't start the engine right away. He sat there, staring at the diner, the old man now safely on his way, the hum of the quiet street pressing around him. What have I been doing my whole life? The thought lodged itself in his mind, heavy, unshakable. His family, his wife, his children, they wouldn't have stopped. They wouldn't have helped. They wouldn't have even noticed. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head, his fingers tightening on the steering wheel. I need to do something. Not because he felt guilty, not because he owed them, but because for the first time he wanted to. John drove back in silence. The familiar hum of the engine, once a comforting symbol of his success, now felt distant, almost meaningless. His hands gripped the wheel, but his mind was elsewhere, tangled in thoughts that refused to settle. He had come out here searching for nothing, just an escape, a breath of air away from the cold, indifferent walls of his home. Instead, he had found something that gnawed at him, something he couldn't ignore. Those boys laughing, helping, giving without a second thought. Helen refusing his money like it was an insult, because what she offered came from a place money couldn't touch. The way the town moved, the way people looked out for each other, how they noticed things that his own family never had. Had he really spent 65 years believing he had won at life, only to realize he had never truly lived? The thought unsettled him. It made his stomach tighten in a way that no business deal, no financial loss, no corporate betrayal ever had. As he pulled into the long, winding driveway of his estate, the gates closing behind him with their usual mechanical precision, the vast emptiness of it all hit him like a blow to the chest. The house was enormous, immaculate, every inch of it designed for prestige, luxury, power. And yet, it felt smaller than that tiny diner. He stepped inside. The silence was deafening. No laughter, no warmth, just cold marble floors and the distant ticking of a grandfather clock, the only thing keeping track of time in a house that had long since stopped feeling like a home. His wife wasn't waiting for him. His children didn't ask where he had gone. They were all somewhere within these walls, but none of them were truly here. He poured himself a drink, standing by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. It was beautiful, an empire he had built, a world he had conquered, but tonight it looked different. It looked empty. For the first time in his life, John Patterson felt poor. The next morning he made his decision. He would go back, but this time as himself. When he pulled up to Helen's diner in the bright light of day, the change in atmosphere was immediate. No longer just a stranger passing through, no longer the disheveled man with a broken-down car. He arrived in full measure of who he was. A tailored suit. A different car, equally extravagant. A presence that demanded attention. And attention he got. People stared. Conversations paused. Suspicious eyes followed him as he stepped onto the sidewalk. Helen, standing outside wiping her hands on a towel, raised an eyebrow. "Didn't expect to see you again." John gave her a small smile. "Didn't expect to come back." The boys were nearby, leaning against the diner's wall, eyeing him like they didn't quite recognize him anymore. The taller one squinted. "You rich or something?" John chuckled. "Something like that." The shorter boy frowned. "Then why'd you let us think you were like?" John hesitated. "Because last night I was." That silenced them. But the town was still watching. Whispers passed between neighbors. Rich men didn't come here. Not unless they were buying something. Not unless they wanted something. "What you're doing here?" one of the older men asked, stepping forward. His tone wasn't hostile, but it wasn't welcoming either. John inhaled, then exhaled. "I want to help." A pause. Then laughter. Not from the boys, not from Helen, but from a group of men sitting near a hardware store across the street. "Help," one of them, stocky and middle-aged, crossed his arms. "People like you don't help people like us." John expected this. Understood it. Because if someone had walked into his office a week ago, claiming they wanted to help without expecting anything in return, he wouldn't have believed them either. So, instead of arguing, he nodded. "You're right. People like me usually don't. But that doesn't mean I can't start now." The man narrowed his eyes. "Why? What do you get out of it?" John thought about that for a moment. "I get to leave something behind that actually means something," he said finally. "Something more than just numbers on a screen." Silence. The town didn't trust him. But trust wasn't something that could be bought. It had to be earned. So John did what he had always done best. He took action. By afternoon, the town was buzzing. A fleet of trucks rolled in, construction crews, architects, engineers. Not businessmen in suits, not corporate sharks looking to squeeze profit from the land. Workers, builders, people who had been paid well in advance to do one thing: rebuild. The old gas station. It would become a community center, a place for people to gather, to learn, to grow. The abandoned lot on 5th Street. A shelter. Not just a temporary one, but a place with real beds, real kitchens, a real chance for stability. The diner. Renovated, expanded, made into something that could feed more people, help more families. And Helen. Helen wouldn't have to pay a single cent for it. And the best part, the people didn't believe it at first. They questioned it. They doubted him. Rich people don't do this for free. What's the catch? But then they saw it happening. Brick by brick, board by board, nail by nail. And slowly, doubt turned into curiosity. Curiosity turned into cautious hope. And hope turned into something real. The first to break was Helen. She stepped onto the newly paved sidewalk outside her diner, watching the workers, her arms crossed. When John walked by, she called out, "You serious about all this?" John, wiping his hands clean from dust after checking on the shelter's progress, looked at her and nodded. "As serious as I've ever been about anything." Helen stared at him for a long time. Then, with a small smirk, she said, "Well, hell, guess that means I gotta start serving more customers, huh?" The boys? The boys didn't need words. They just grinned. The town. They weren't ready to call him one of their own. Not yet. But as John stood there, watching this place change, watching them change, he realized something. He wasn't doing this just for them. He was doing it for himself. Time moved differently in the town. Days stretched long, filled with the rhythmic hum of hammers against wood, the laughter of children playing near the construction sites, the quiet, persistent work of rebuilding lives. John was there through all of it, not as an outsider, not as a distant benefactor, but as a man finally a part of something real. He had once thought legacy was measured in numbers, in financial reports, in the empire he had built over decades. But now, as he walked the streets of the town, as people nodded to him with something resembling trust, as Helen slapped him on the back for ordering coffee like a regular damn person, as the two boys darted past him, yelling about their new home and the shelter he had helped fund, he realized he had been wrong. Legacy wasn't in what you left behind. It was in who you left it with. But time wasn't something he could rebuild. The illness crept in faster than he expected. The fatigue at first, subtle at first, barely noticeable, just a heaviness in his limbs at the end of the day. Then the coughing fits. The weight loss. The growing struggle to climb the steps of the new shelter without needing to pause. He tried to ignore it, tried to push through. But the people noticed. Helen was the first to say something. "You look like hell," she said one morning, arms crossed, studying him the way only she could. "You need rest." John smiled. "Rest is for people who have time." She didn't argue. She just looked at him. And in that look, he saw what he had never seen from his wife or his children: concern. One afternoon, when the final brick was laid on the new schoolhouse, someone suggested a picture. The entire town gathered, standing shoulder to shoulder, from the elderly man who had lived here for decades to the young families who had finally found stability in the homes John had helped build. Helen stood beside him, arms crossed but smiling. The two boys pushed their way to the front, grinning like they had just won something. Someone handed John a framed copy of the photo. He stared at it for a long moment, running his fingers over the edges, feeling the weight of something he had never had before. A family. That night, the pain came sharper than before. The next morning, he couldn't get out of bed. The hospital room was cold. Sterile. Too much like the life he had left behind. He had been here before, a long time ago, when he first got the diagnosis. Back then, he had felt nothing, just the empty weight of inevitability. But now he felt regret, not for what was coming, but for what he would be leaving. The first visitors were his family. Eleanor arrived first, her heels clicking against the hospital floor as she swept into the room. She looked at him the way someone looks at a burden. "You should have told me sooner," she said, but her tone was flat. Behind her, Richard and Sarah stood, checking their phones, their expressions unreadable. "We'll make sure everything is taken care of," Richard said, glancing up for a brief moment before returning to whatever urgent message he was responding to. "You should have spent your last month somewhere better," Sarah murmured, barely meeting his eyes. "Not in that town." John said nothing. Because what was there to say? They had come out of obligation, because it was expected, because he was dying, and soon his money would belong to them. When they left, he didn't watch them go. But when the next visitors arrived, he did. The boys burst in first, their usual energy subdued but still present. "You look awful," the taller one said bluntly. John smirked. "Good to see you too." Helen came next, carrying a basket of food. Not store-bought, not something put together by an assistant, real food. Homemade soup, fresh bread, something warm, something meant to help. "You need to eat," she said, setting it down on the small table beside his bed. "Hospital food will kill you before the cancer does." John chuckled, but the sound came out weaker than he wanted it to. "Always looking out for me, huh?" Helen shrugged. "Somebody's got to." One by one they came, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The people from the shelter, the workers from the construction crew, the parents whose children now had a school to go to, people who had once looked at him with suspicion, but now looked at him like he mattered. Not because of his wealth, but because of who he had become. And when the room was empty again, when night fell and the hospital hummed with quiet, he reached for the picture, the one from the town square, the one where he was surrounded by people who had welcomed him, despite everything. His fingers brushed over the faces, the boys grinning like they always did, Helen smirking like she knew something he didn't, the people who had once doubted him, but had come to trust him, A slow breath left his lips. And for the first time in his life, John Patterson smiled. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.